Good evening, or I guess you say afternoon, isn't it? After such a wonderful meal, it can feel like time has slowed down just a little bit, but nevertheless, it is good to see everybody here. What a wonderful day, what a wonderful blessing it is that we can gather together on such a day as it is to enjoy each other's fellowship. As you guys know, here on third Sundays, we've been going over a series of lessons on Don't Be Foolish. And this Sunday, as we've looked at the past, we've looked at Don't Be Foolish concerning God, and we looked at two different aspects of that, two different ways in which the book of Proverbs in particular, being our text, where we'll go to for the great lessons on foolishness and wisdom of us not being foolish. We see that, of course, there's a lot of things in life in which we can find ourselves being in a position of being against God foolish in His sight. And so I want us to begin by looking at today, don't be foolish about self-control. But we're going to, before we begin with that, think about something considering the book of Nehemiah. In the book of Nehemiah, it opens up with Nehemiah receiving some very tragic news, doesn't it? There in Nehemiah 1 through 3, we see Nehemiah receives information that his hometown, remember Nehemiah was a part of the 70 years of captivity that Babylon had destroyed the southern kingdom of Judah and taken them into captivity, had dispersed them across the kingdom, and Nehemiah was a part of that. And at this time, during the book of Nehemiah, the Persians, they had taken control. They had defeated Babylon. And there were already some, about 100 years before Nehemiah's day, there were already some who had come out of captivity. Remember, King Cyrus of the Persians had let the remnant go back to Jerusalem. And he had told them, listen, you can rebuild the temple, you can rebuild the city, rebuild its walls. Cyrus had given them that decree. But as we remember through our minor prophet studies, it was during this time that the Israelites dealt with a lot of conflict. The Samaritans, and this is where the battle between the Jews and the Samaritans really came in play. The Samaritans caused them great harm. Remember, the temple went, though the foundation laid, the temple went close to 10 to 15 years without being built. Until God finally sent some prophets and said, listen, this has got to end. You've got your houses, I need mine built. Well, fast forward, when Zerubbabel comes and brings a remnant, about 40 years later, Ezra brings another remnant. Well, Nehemiah is here, and like I said, about 100 years after that first remnant came to Jerusalem, and he gets told that the walls are still not built. The walls of Jerusalem, the capital city of Judah, his hometown that he had been taken from, most likely as quite a young child, but nevertheless, Nehemiah, a cupbearer to King Artaxerxes of the Medo-Persians, Nehemiah hears there in verse 3 that his beloved hometown, his city, the capital city, Jerusalem, that was so great, so mighty, the walls and the gates are still in rubble, still having been burnt down, still remnants of Babylon's destruction. And it says at that time that Nehemiah, he wept bitterly. He was fasting and praying for several days because the walls had not been built. Why was Nehemiah so worried about the wall and the gate that were laying in ruins and destruction? What effect did it have, or why was Nehemiah so bothered by hearing this information? Nehemiah 1 and 3, to cause several days of mourning, weeping, praying. What was the reason? The answer really lies in the role of walls, doesn't it? For us, it seems silly to think that anyone would cry over hearing that a wall was not built. But back during that time, a wall was symbolic of so many things. Every ancient city, if it didn't have a wall, was subject to great destruction. A wall represented, whether it be one layer or two layer, a wall represented that which was built on defense and protection. If Jerusalem was open. If Jerusalem was without walls, they could be attacked at any time. So the walls of a city was a symbol of security. It was symbolic and often used in the Bible, even throughout the Scriptures, as such. In fact, in Revelation 21:15 through 27, as we see the new heavens and the new earth come down, and that great city come down, what do we notice? Huge walls protecting it. Why? Walls represented safety, security. With this in mind, I want us to look at Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 28. In Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 28, we read this: "A man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls." You see, when we look at our first point this morning, a fool lacks self-control. The Bible clearly demonstrates, the Bible clearly says that one who does not have self-control is one who is without a wall. When we think of this and we recognize this and look at this, walls are as people, as individuals, in the sight of God, walls are our best defense against evil. Let's look again. Proverbs 25, verse 28. "A man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls." If someone is without self-control in their lives, they are just as helpless as Jerusalem was at the time Nehemiah received that information. You see, self-control gives us the ability to restrain our sinful appetites and avoid temptation that can ensnare us and bring us down spiritually and bring shame upon ourselves. As one man put it, how many criminals have we seen with a perp walk? And these are people with usually lacking in self-control. How many of them, once they've been caught and they're doing that perp walk from one point to the other, their heads are down and they're in shame? Why is that the case? It's because they didn't have self-control. They didn't control their sinful appetites. They allowed themselves to get caught up in illegal activity in critical areas of their lives. When we look at the book of Proverbs, the Proverbs has a lot to say, doesn't it, about different avenues of self-control. In Proverbs 6 through 11, it's talking about work ethic or lack thereof, not self-control, to work as they should. The ant works as he should, the sluggard doesn't. In Proverbs 10:19, it talks about too much talking, not having self-control of the mouth. In Proverbs 11 and verse 12, it talks about belittling others and not controlling oneself and how they interact. In Proverbs 15, 1 and 2, it's talking about speaking rashly and unwisely, not controlling the tongue, in other words. In Proverbs 17, verse 14, it's talking about quarreling. In Proverbs 19:11, it's talking about anger. We could go on and on and on. What's the point of all this? Fools lack self-control. And the book of Proverbs is trying to get that across. Solomon, as he gathered these Proverbs and wrote these Proverbs, he lets it be known throughout this great book that, listen, it is a fool who is willing to allow themselves not to have self-control. We could go on and on, as I said, through each of these verses, look at them, but the reality is, as one looks at these, we would see this conclusion. This should, and I preface should, lead us to a conclusion that the wise will therefore love self-control. If the foolish despise self-control, those who are wise then are ones who love self-control. So how can we embody self-control? How can self-control help us? Well, self-control, like the walls of an ancient city, provide numerous benefits. And I want to talk about 3 benefits they provide for us. There are 3 things in particular when we look at the correlation of Proverbs 25:28 and self-control and walls that are necessary in our lives. First is security. With self-control, we are safe from many self-inflicted ills. If we have the wall of self-security, of self-control, we are secure in our walk with God. If we have self-control, it will help us. It will give us a defense. It will give us security against these self-inflicted things that are so easily ensnaring. A non-Christian lady I know was talking to her the other day, and she was mentioning some of her being raised, and she now has her mom living with her, and she said, listen, as we got to talking and discussing things, she said, and I don't remember how we even got on the topic, but she said one of the problems her mom has and her sister has is that she was raised in a home that mom was an alcoholic and took drugs. And her sister her whole life has dealt with this problem. And as she talked about this, she said, but I learned a long time ago that if I was not going to fall into that, I needed self-control. I needed to never touch it. Whether it was drugs, alcohol. This is from a non-Christian, not someone who thinks it's necessarily wrong for someone else with self-control. She's like, listen, I learned a long time ago, I have to have self-control. I have to be able to not fall into this. I see what it's done to my family. I can't be that. I can't do that. She had a self-imposed or self-controlled situation. She didn't want to implode or self-implode because she didn't have self-control. When it comes to the walls of self-control that we should put around us, kind of like the belt of truth or the armor of God, when we have this wall around us, it provides us security from ourselves. It keeps us secure. When we are able to say no to that which we need to say no to, there is security in that. The second thing that it does, it creates boundaries, doesn't it? When we think of self-control, one who is self-controlled knows where their limits are. We know how far we can go, which is different from not understanding that, because the one who is foolish and does not exercise self-control won't know their boundaries. They don't have that wall around them to let them know, listen, this is too much. People without boundaries are always surprised, aren't they, at the trouble they get themselves into. Christians got me hooked in watching some of these live PD shows and PD cams and things of that nature. And it is amazing how many times the officer goes up to them and says, listen, you've been doing this, this, and this, or this is your warrant. And they're totally surprised that they've been caught. That anyone would have any problem with anything they're doing. That they have stepped over the boundary. That's what happens when there's no self-control. Boundaries are a result of that. Boundaries are a result of the wall of self-control that we should and keep around us. A hedge of protection, if you will. Not only does it bring security, it brings us an awareness of where our limits are. Listen, limits can be different for different people. What I struggle with might not be what you struggle with. You might be able to go a little further, not into sin. I'm not talking about sinning, but go a little further, maybe helping someone in sin. Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. Remember, it says, you who are spiritual, restore such a one, but guard yourselves in doing. There might be certain sins that I can't go to as easily or as far with someone to help bear their burden, but you can, because you know your boundaries. Your boundaries are further into that than mine. I might not guard myself as I should. Self-control lets us know this, doesn't it? It makes us aware of where those boundaries are. Thirdly, the wall of self-control, it teaches us community. With self-control, we find ourselves with others who are committed to living within the same boundaries, the same limits, the same security as we are. Shared values bind us together. That's why when one falls in an area, and with a group like the family here, if one of us falls, that's why we all hurt. Because self-control teaches us and promotes community. It makes us want to be around people that are like us. That's why it's hard for people who don't have self-control to really have relationships. You ever notice that? That people that don't have self-control in their lives, they can't relate to other people in the same way. Or they are with people who don't have any self-control either. It's hard for them to recognize and feel close to someone that violates their boundaries. Listen, there's a lot of people I like being around in this world. I have friends who aren't Christians that I like being around, but there's points where they can make me feel uncomfortable because they have gone beyond the boundaries that I want to go. Self-control helps keep us in control. Self-control not only brings us security, it only brings us boundaries, but it brings us a community. Self-control is what God has desired for all His creation. But it is what He expects from those who have obeyed His gospel. He wants everyone to be self-controlled. A fool is not in control. He's like one without walls. But the wise is one who understands he must have self-control in everything. This is exactly what Paul was getting at in 1 Corinthians 9, 24 and 27, wasn't it? Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Look at verse 25. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. Paul's saying, listen, I try my best as an apostle, as a child of God, to live self-controlled life in all things. As we examine our lives, as we look at ourselves, it's never too late to build up the wall of self-control in our lives. Just like Nehemiah understood when he talked to the king and got permission to go back home, and was able to help the Israelites regain their pride in seeing the walls come up again. We too, if our wall of self-control has come down, we can build it back up. We are not without that opportunity. But it's only able to happen if we're willing to do it. If we're willing to build the wall of self-control in our lives. Just like the Israelites under Nehemiah, we can build the wall of self-control. We can help ourselves find the security in Christ, know our boundaries in the Lord, and have a confidence with our community of like-minded souls. So as we look at our life, as we examine these things, let it be said of us that we look, we test, and we prove ourselves true in these. And where we find ourselves lacking, we correct. We fix that section of wall and build it back where it needs to be. This afternoon, if there is someone here who needs us to pray for you, maybe you're lacking in self-control in certain areas and you need us to pray for you, to encourage you. As I said before, we will bear that burden with you. You're not alone. All of us have issues from time to time, but there's something that keeps on getting to you, keeps on eating at you, keeps on hindering you. Let us help you. Let us exercise our self-control as the body of Christ to help that member who's struggling here today. If there is someone here who needs this help, who needs this love and this encouragement, come forward now as we stand and as we sing.